Once we recognize that ecosystems respond to factors on multiple timescales, one of the questions that we have for temporal dynamics is how to scale measurements of ecological processes over longer timescales. Temporal extrapolation requires an understanding of the typical timescales of important ecological processes. So here, what we're saying is that if we're going to take a relatively short measurement and extrapolate it over long time periods, we have to make sure that we understand what are the different processes that are important on the longer time scales. So if we measure over a short period, how do we calculate what happens over a longer period? In this case, we might take a look at a photosynthetic rate of a leaf, but only measure that photosynthetic rate over a short time period. When we do that, we'll get a rate for that short time period, say a couple minutes, but we might be curious about what happens over longer time periods, such as a year. To do that, we have to take an approach that allows us to scale these short-term measurements to longer time scales, temporal scaling. So let's say we make one measurement over a minute time period, and then we have the question of what's going to happen over the year. We can't just take that 1 minute measurement and multiply it by 60 minutes times 24 hours times 365 days to see what happens over the course of a year, because there's going to be different factors that affect what the photosynthetic rate is on different timescales. So we might have a diurnal timescale, for example, where photosynthetic rates go up and then they go down when it's dark and then go up again. So that would incorporate some of the patterns that we see on a daily timescale, but also realizing that within that there's going to be seasonal patterns too. So unfortunately, we can't just take a measurement that we do over a single minute and multiply it by scalars to scale it up to a longer time period. One response is to measure important processes over longer periods. So photosynthetic rate might be measured over a single minute, but we can measure photosynthetic rates over longer and longer times. In many cases, that's relatively unreasonable, and so we have to use other approaches. One of the ways to start to think about longer timescale processes is to use indices that integrate over longer time periods. In a previous example, we had looked at how Dln15 integrates nitrogen availability over relatively long timescales, and then we can use indices to reconstruct over longer and longer time periods. Other examples that the book gives, for example, are using carbon isotopes, which represent water use efficiency. And if we take a look at the C13 to C12 ratio of plant biomass, that gives us a seasonal integration of water use efficiency. Measuring water use efficiency on an individual leaf requires us putting a leaf in a chamber and taking a look at the amount of carbon and water that goes into and out of a chamber. It's relatively intensive. It's something we can do on the scale of a couple minutes, but it's really hard to do at the seasonal scale. In contrast, we can just measure a leaf at the end of the season, measure its C13 to C12 ratio, and then that gives us an index of water use efficiency over the entire season, or at least when the biomass was being produced. There's also a little bit of text in the last section of the chapter that goes over models and how we use models. But using a model doesn't necessarily solve the problem of scaling up. It just gives us a tool to take processes that we understand occur at different scales and incorporate them into our predictions. What's important when we're thinking about temporal scaling is to focus clearly on the processes that are important over the time scales of interest. This is the last figure in the chapter, it's figure 12.19, and this shows variation in return time for variables that strongly affect ecosystem processes. So on the x-axis we have return time, and this is essentially the scale at which different processes occur. So we have some factors that occur relatively quickly, stomatal opening and closure, that happens on 10 to the negative fourth years, so 1,000th of a year, 1/10,000th of a year. That's relatively quick. And then we have other things like a diurnal cycle that happens on a daily scale, weather fronts that happen on a weekly scale, other factors such as the seasonal pattern, which is an annual scale, and then others that happen at scales longer than a year. El Nino cycles happen on somewhere the order of 5 to 10 years. We have standard replicating disturbances that might happen every 100 years, and then glacial cycles that happen somewhere on the order of every 10,000 years. Apparently that number is wrong. It shouldn't be -4. It should just be 4 and 6. So what this figure shows is that when we're thinking about timescales on the order of a year, it doesn't make sense to think about migrations or glaciers. On the other hand, if we're thinking about responses to glacial events, we're not necessarily going to have to include factors such as photosynthetic rates and stomatal closure. We can integrate that there. But if we're going to take a measurement that happens on a daily scale, and we want to scale it up to the annual cycle, we have to take into account different weather fronts that are going to happen and the factors that are important at the annual cycle, such as seasonal patterns.